5,000 steps, not 1,000, not 2,000, not the number that is just stamped onto every fitness track you've ever owned. 5,000 steps. Because if you're somebody who currently does just a few hundred steps a day, who drives to work, who sits at a desk, drives home, and then sinks into the sofa for the evening, then going from where you are right now to just 5,000 steps a day will do more for your body than almost anything else I could ask of you. And that is exactly who this video is for. It's for those people starting from close to nothing. The ones who have been told 100 times to move more, and in the end, they just give up because the target always felt impossible. Now, I've said in a few recent videos that when you look at the research, the biggest bang for your buck sits somewhere around 7,500 steps a day. And that 1,000 is often just putting people off because it feels so far away that they just never lace their shoes up and, they just don't do anything in the first place. But there is a part of that curve that almost nobody talks about, and it's the most important part of all of this. So today I want to walk you through, pardon the pun, exactly what happens inside your body, inside your muscles, to your blood vessels, in your brain, when you go from sedentary to 5,000 steps. Because that first stretch is where the real magic lives. And once you understand what's actually going on under the bonnet, it becomes much harder to stay on the sofa. If you're new to this channel, then welcome. My name is Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor who now spends most of his time teaching the things that keep people out of my department in the first place. And if this is useful to you, then a like, a subscribe, and a hype always push this to more people, and it costs you nothing. So thank you for doing that. So did you know that going from almost no walking up to a modest daily amount does more for how long you live than going from very active to just slightly more active to, super active? Here's a thing that nobody really explains properly. The relationship between steps and how long you live, it's not just a straight line. It is a curve, and the shape of that curve changes everything. When researchers pull together all of these really big studies on this exact topic, tens of thousands of peoples followed for years and years, the curve was steepest right down at the bottom near sedentary. Going from around 2,000 steps a day up to around 4,000 or 5,000 steps produced the single largest drop in the risk of dying from anything across the whole range. After that, the line does keep improving. More steps is better for you, but it starts to flatten off. So each extra 1,000 steps that you do buys you a little less than the one before. So the person going from 500 steps up to 5,000 is gaining far, far more step for step than the person grinding up from, say, 8,000 to 13,000 steps. So if you've been sitting still, if you are a largely sedentary person, you are sitting on the single most valuable part of that entire graph, which means the very first steps that you take are the most powerful ones that you will ever take. And I really, really want to drive this home in this video for anybody who finds the whole idea of exercise daunting. Anybody who has already convinced themselves that, they could never be fit enough to do a proper workout. This is who I'm speaking to in this video. The research says it in black and white. You do not need a gym or a training plan or a single drop of sweat to claim a huge chunk of this benefit. Getting up and wandering around the house a few times during the day or around the block, or preferably doing something social or gardening, anything like that, or walking to the kettle and back throughout the day. All of it adds up, and faster than you would think easily, into a few thousand steps throughout the day. So that isn't like a consolation prize. That is exactly the part of the curve where the biggest gains are hiding. Now, there is a study that I find myself thinking about quite often when I talk about these sorts of things, and it completely changes how you see a simple walk. In this particular study, and as always, I will link it in the description below so you can take a read of it. Researchers took very healthy, active young people, the kind walking around 1,000 steps a day without even thinking about it. And they asked them to do just one thing, to drop right down to around 1,500 steps a day. So 1,500 steps a day, which is roughly where a lot of people genuinely sit. And then to stay there for a couple of weeks, just 2 weeks. And in that short window, their bodies got measurably worse at handling blood sugar. Their insulin stopped working as well, fat started to gather around their middle, and their fitness dropped off. They had gone from healthy to heading in the wrong direction in a fortnight purely from sitting still. But here's the flip side to that, because when they got moving again, a lot of it reversed. So why does something as simple as moving your legs actually do all of that? Well, it's because your muscles are the single biggest sugar disposal system that you own. Every time a muscle contracts, it pulls sugar straight out of your bloodstream to fuel, to sort of, produce energy for that movement. And it can do it without waiting around for insulin to push it in the right place. So a body that walks is a body that clears sugar out of the blood all day long, and a body that sits still loses that protection fast. And a persistently high blood sugar is what underpins so much of the chronic disease that we see in the Western world these days. This is why it's so important. This is why the walk that actually matters isn't the occasional hike up Scarfell Pike or Ben Nearest or whatever. It is the gentle 10 minutes after your biggest meal when the sugar is flooding in and your muscles are right there to soak it all up. So you're not really walking the meal off. You are just giving all of that sugar somewhere useful to go. And when you do that decade after decade, your risk of major disease absolutely does come down. So let's move on to blood pressure then, because blood pressure is one of those numbers that can sit in the background for years, slowly wearing away at your arteries long before it ever gives you a single symptom. And a daily walk turns out to be one of the simplest ways that we have to bring your blood pressure down. And the mechanism is really simple to get your head around. It works really well when you walk. Blood flows faster through your arteries because everything is just working faster when you walk. And that faster flow drags against the delicate inner lining of the blood vessels, a single layer called the endothelium. Now that dragging, which scientists call shear stress, it sounds like it ought to be harmful. She spelled S-H-E-A-R, but it is the opposite of harmful. It acts as a signal and it tells the endothelium to release a gas called nitric oxide, which is basically your body's own blood pressure medication, because it tells the muscular walls of your arteries, because every artery has a layer of muscle, it tells them to relax and widen so blood flows through it at a lower pressure. So do this regularly. Then over the weeks, your arteries become more elastic and more responsive, and your resting blood pressure gradually drifts down, often by a few points. Now, a few points might not sound like a lot. It might sound like nothing to you. But here's where it gets really powerful. That drop is just from one simple habit, just walking a bit more. When you stack it on top of a bit of strength work that I often talk about, and a few more leafy greens that I often talk about, and a bit less ultra-processed food. Each of those nudges the number down as well. They don't just add together, they compound. They sort of multiply, and suddenly you are looking at a properly meaningful fall in your blood pressure. The kind that seriously lowers your lifetime risk of stroke and heart attack, because it is the constant grinding pressure year after year. This steadily damages your vessels in your brain and your kidneys and your heart. And your heart muscle itself actually benefits at the very same time when you walk, because you're asking it to do a little more work, a little more often. And like any muscle, it grows stronger and more efficient, so it can move more blood with every single beat, and it can rest more between them. And that's why your resting heart rate comes down the fitter you become, because your heart is simply more efficient. So let's talk about what walking actually does to your mood and your brain. So you've probably felt this one without ever putting a name to it. So just say you're stuck on a problem, or your head's in a bit of a mess, or you're sitting, with a bit of a low mood, and you go out for a walk, and somewhere along the way, things start to loosen and settle to make a bit more sense again, and your mood just improves, or things just become a bit clearer in your head. That isn't just your imagination, or rather, it is in your head, just in a very physical way. When you move your body, your working muscles release chemical messengers into your blood, and your brain responds by producing more of a substance called BDNF. The simplest way to picture BDNF is a kind of fertilizer for your brain cells. It literally helps your existing neurons stay healthy. It encourages them to form new connections, and it even supports the growth of brand new brain cells in the area most tied to memory. So this is a big part of why people who walk regularly, across decades during their lives, tend to have lower rates of depression and hold on to a sharper memory into old age. In fact, some trials have actually found that for milder versions of depression, getting people walking regularly can work about as well, if not better, than medication, which still amazes me every single time I read it. We all know somebody that is on antidepressants. Well, most people know somebody that's on antidepressants. And out of all the people I know, I don't know any of them that have ever been told this by their doctor, that getting out and walking and exercising can be as powerful as medication. And on a much shorter time scale, that same burst of movement lifts your mood for literally hours afterwards through a rise in endorphins and other feel-good chemicals while burning off some of the excess stress hormones that are sloshing around in your system. There is a reason why I do some of my best thinking and some of my best mood mending out on a walk with my Labrador Mango. This isn't just a coincidence. I would say all of the good ideas I've had in my life have come when I've been walking, usually through a field. But what does all of this actually feel like from the inside in real life? Well, for a lot of people going from sedentary to 5,000 steps, the first thing they notice within a couple of weeks is more energy, which sounds completely backwards. You spend energy, but then you gain energy. How can that happen? But that is exactly what happens, because inside your cells sit these tiny power stations called mitochondria. And when you start moving regularly, your body builds more of them and makes the ones that you've already got work better. As with everything, it all just becomes more efficient. More power stations, more mitochondria means more energy on tap for everything else you do. And I can tell you this one from my own personal experience again. And back when I would be working, night shift after night shift in the A&E, and I was completely shattered, I found that going for a run of all things actually helped me to focus better and feel more alert and awake on shift. And I would do that after I'd wake up before the next night shift. And it sounds a bit daft, doesn't it? Because you'd be forgiven for thinking that the last thing an exhausted person needs is to go and burn more energy, that what they need really is rest. But I found the opposite to be true, and it's backed up by what we find in the research. And it's the same these days when George has, absolutely run us ragged, and Steph and I are completely running on empty. Getting out and moving still leaves us feeling better than just slumping on the sofa and watching a bit of Netflix. On top of the energy, sleep typically tends to deepen the more walking you do, because a body that is moved during the day sinks more easily into a restorative sleep, with those stages of sleep becoming a lot deeper and a bit longer as well. You may notice that your mood lifts as well. Stairs and slopes that used to leave you puffing out of breath start to feel a bit easier as your heart and your lungs and your muscles adapt and you get fitter. And maybe the biggest change of all is just how you start to actually see yourself. You begin to think of yourself as somebody who moves. You begin to think of yourself as somebody who is active. And that shift tends to drag other good habits along in its wake, almost without you trying. Now, obviously, steps are not the whole picture here, and I would be doing you a big disservice to pretend that they are. You still need to lift something heavy a couple of times a week to hold on to your muscle, because walking on its own doesn't really build much strength. And you still cannot walk your way out of a bad diet built on ultra-processed food, because you simply cannot outrun what a modern diet piles on. Walking is one lever among several levers, and the real power comes from the combination held for many years and decades. But if you're starting from nothing, then walking is one of the habits that I would reach for first, because it is one of the easiest ones to do. It is the hardest to hurt yourself doing. And it moves so much in terms of your health, when you start from nothing and just walking a few thousand steps a day. So once you're actually walking, and I really, really hope there are some of you watching this who are sitting down right now and decide, you know what, let's just listen to the rest of this video while I'm walking. Why don't you just put your shoes on now, pause the video, stop what you're doing, and just watch or listen to the last couple of minutes while you're walking. If you're doing that, let me give you a handful of small upgrades that really squeeze far more out of the exact same walk. Because a step is never just a step. The first one is my favorite. Why don't you phone a friend or a family member while you get your steps in? That does two really lovely things at once. It knocks out a chunk of the social connection that, as I bang on about all the time, is one of the strongest predictors of a long and happy life. And here's the really sneaky bit here. So many of us, the second that we take a call, what do? We sit down, don't we, to concentrate. So, deciding that a phone call means you get up and walk turns every catch up with your mum or your mate or whoever, it turns that into an extra 20 minutes on your feet. And those minutes stack up really fast across a week without ever feeling like exercise. The second upgrade is to scatter tiny bursts of effort throughout the walk. So every so often, say every couple of minutes, why don't you drop and do a few bodyweight squats, at a bench that you can hold on to, or some lunges, or take a flight of stairs with a bit of purpose, bit of a speed walk rather than just plotting up them or taking the elevator or whatever. Those little spikes of intensity, which we've started calling vigorous intermittent activity, they do far more for your heart and your legs than the same few minutes just spent gently strolling, because they briefly push the system harder and force it to adapt. And the third one, the one that I would protect above all others, is to walk after your main meal, preferably after everything that you eat. But if you're starting from scratch, why not just start walking after your first or your main meal, the big one that you have in the evening, ideally 10 or 15 minutes for all of the blood sugar reasons that we've gone through earlier. If you're starting from nothing, you don't need all of these in one go. Just pick one and let it become second nature. And really, for me, that is the heart of it. If you take nothing else away from this video, take the fact that the first steps that you do, the ones from your sofa up to a few thousand a day, are the most powerful ones that you will ever take. And they happen to be the ones most within reach. You do not have to overhaul anything in your life to get this benefit or hit some perfect number. Just let that number climb on its own as walking slowly becomes a normal part of your day, but preferably with some short bursts of intensity in there. And the final thing I'd recommend is investing in something that actually tracks your steps. It tells you how many steps you're doing that day. You'll be surprised how it's easy to underestimate it. You could spend $30 on a cheap fitness watch on Amazon, or you could invest in something like a Garmin. I think mine's a Forerunner 955. This is a few £100s. This isn't necessary for everybody, but if you want to buy this, then it will also track your HRV, your sleep score, your V2 max, loads of different things. And it's great for any sort of workouts or, I use mine for triathlon training, but you don't need to spend that much money. But if you can see a number on the screen, even if it's $30, it really is a good motivator. Now, if you've got any questions about any of this, then please do pop them in the comments below. I do read all of them, and I use them to track future videos. And if somebody comes to mind who has drifted out of the habit of moving and feels a bit defeated by it, and I'm sure all of us can relate to somebody or think of somebody like that, it might be worth sharing this video with them, because the idea that the first few steps are the most powerful ones is a really hopeful one. I'm hoping that this will really encourage loads of people. So I really hope you found this video useful, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.